Welcome to A Conversation. I'm Mike Farrell, president of Death Penalty Focus. Just over a year ago, the state of Virginia abolished its death penalty. It was an historic moment, one that I don't think many expected to see in their lifetimes. First execution in this country took place in Virginia in 1608, and Virginia has executed more people in its history than in any other state. And it was the first Southern state to repeal capital punishment, first of the solid South, as we think of it. So we've asked two people who were instrumental in this amazing achievement to tell us how it happened from their perspective, whether they think other states will follow, and what advice they'd give activists, legislators, and criminal justice advocates who are working for abolition in their states. Michael Stone is an administrator and the administrator and former executive director of Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Dale Blumfield is the current executive director of VADP. Welcome to you both. Before we get started,
good to be here, Mike. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you with us. Before we get started, let me just add that both Michael and Dale were honored at our 30th annual awards event on March 24th. We hope if you weren't there, you'll go to the Death Penalty Focus YouTube video and view it. So to begin, Michael, can you give us a bit of history about what got you into abolition? I know this wasn't the first attempt. Were there clues in Virginia's legal history that led you to believe the time might be right?
That's actually a two-part question. Let me start by talking about how I personally got involved in the abolition movement. I moved to Virginia in 1984 to go to work at the Catholic Diocese of Richmond in their Office of Justice and Peace. And our bishop at the time, a great man, Walter Francis Sullivan, always encouraged diocesan staff people to attend vigils on the nights of executions at the old state penitentiary, not far from the state capitol in Richmond. And a couple months after I moved here, I attended a vigil that night, and I was one of maybe 40 people standing in silent vigil with a candle on one side of a busy 4-lane divided road, standing below the 20-foot brick walls with razor wire of the Virginia State Penitentiary, which was, I think, commissioned by Thomas Jefferson, give you an idea how old the structure was. Wow. And then on the other side of that divided 4-lane road was well over 100 people who were involved in what I would call kind of drunken revelry, celebrating the death of an African-American man, and that there were a large number of overtly racist signs and racist chants about executing more people, frying more people, and with a lot of racist terminology thrown in. And it was a very stark moment. At that time, I had kind of a vague intellectual opposition to the death penalty. But in that moment, it became crystal clear to me that if the death penalty could do this to us as a society, there was something profoundly wrong with it. And from that time forward, I became intensely interested in death penalty abolition. Ironically, wouldn't be another 25 years before I got involved directly in the abolition movement, first working as a regional organizer with the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, and then a 6-year stint as executive director of Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty.
Wow.
But I think the writing was on the wall that the death penalty was going to end in Virginia, largely because of a remarkable group of capital defense attorneys who had a streak of victories in death penalty cases that date back to 2011. I think that was the last year in which anybody was sentenced to death here in Virginia. So by the time the 2021 legislative session rolled around, death row was down to 2 people, and no one had been sentenced to death in 10 years. And that really enabled us to open the conversation about abolition in a meaningful way, because those remarkable attorneys had all but ended it at that point.
Gotcha. Well, what about, tell us a little, if you will, about your strategy. Were there certain legislators or groups that you targeted?
Well, I have to credit Dale is doing a key part of that work. Dale came on in, what was it,
2017.
2017.
Yeah, it was a latecomer.
We were able to double our staff from 1 to 2. And Dale came on as a full-time field organizer, focusing on working in conservative parts of the state where VADP had very little, if any, presence, in districts of Republicans who sat on either the Senate or House Courts of Justice committees, who were going to be key on any reform vote or abolition vote, to try to build conservative support for abolition. And I'm sure Dale will get into that a little bit later. But he really helped, I think, engage a much wider group of people in the abolition movement within Virginia. And that really enabled us to enter into conversations with legislators who may not have been even willing to talk with us prior to that work.
Wow. Well, Dale, your interest in abolition was made visible when you wrote an op-ed in a Richmond magazine. What made you write the op-ed?
That op-ed appeared, I think, in 2009 or 2010. And so that really makes me a latecomer to this abolition movement. Although I will say I was at that same 1984 execution that Michael was just talking about. I was in kind of a third party. I was there covering it for a magazine at the time, and I was absolutely appalled. I thought, this is 1984. It looks like 1884. I mean, this is right out of this was a Jim Crow moment, that execution down there. But in 2009 or 2010, I wrote this editorial for a local publication. It was called Double Lifers. And what prompted me was not so much outright knowledge or wanting to abolish the death penalty, but I was struck by how some people that I knew on social media and in person had, you might call it an inconsistent life ethic or a hypocritical life ethic even, comparing abortion to the death penalty and calling for, they want to keep abortion, but were first ones to push the plunger at a lethal injection. And I found that very inconsistent and very hypocritical. So I wrote this op-ed addressing that. And as I tend to do, once I wrote that op-ed, and the initial research that I did into it led me head first, with no parachute, straight down the rabbit hole of the death penalty in Virginia. And I stuck with it for a couple of years. And I said, this death penalty is a really screwed up mess. I mean, we know how bad criminal justice is, but I think, Mike, I'll echo what you said, that the death penalty was the rotten scum at the bottom of the criminal justice barrel. And so, but then I got sidetracked, as I want to do. I went back to grad school in 2012. 2015, I got out and got back. I wrote the history of the Virginia State Penitentiary. And so that started getting me back into the criminal justice story. And then I had an opportunity in 2016 to interview Jerry Gibbons. And Jerry Gibbons, as you know, was the executioner in Virginia for about 18 years. And I noticed that no one in Virginia had interviewed this man. He'd been interviewed all over Europe, but nobody in Virginia had ever heard of him. So I contacted Michael Stone had nothing to do with VADP at the time. I thought Michael would help me get in touch with Jerry Gibbons, which he did. We met at a coffee shop and we chatted. And by the end of that meeting, Michael had asked me if I'd be interested in applying for a board position on VADP, because I was, in his words, a walking encyclopedia of Virginia's death penalty. And I felt like I was barely even scratching the surface, but I was very honored by that. I had to turn it down at the time because I was looking for a full-time job as a recent grad school graduate. And so, but that in turn, all these steps keep going. And I once I get involved, you find a niche in history that you learn more about it than everybody else, whether it's time capsules and Confederate monuments or the underground newspapers or the death penalty. Because we know that executed death penalty inmates are at the absolute bottom of the social strata. Once one of them is executed, they are forgotten. And so I wanted to resurrect some of these stories of these executed criminals. And the more I looked into them, the more appalling the story got. So that led me, when the job came open at the ADP, I said, I've got to apply for this job because I feel like this is what I have to do now. To jump in with my knowledge of the death penalty. I knew a lot of Republicans around Virginia. I had traveled a lot in a previous job, so I knew the state very well. So I was not scared to go out and meet with these Republican groups in these deep red districts and talk to them about the death penalty. And there was a lot of cold calling involved. I was knocking on doors in these counties, but some of them began cracking open. And what I found more than anything was not outright hostility or opposition to abolition. To my point, what I found was people didn't know anything about it. So that's a blank slate. That gave me the opportunity to start the conversation. So that was, and just listen to this. So that was really how this whole passion kind of evolved for me.
Wow. Well, that's now, we know that it requires a group, a village, as they say. And many groups and individuals were involved in the effort that you all put together that ultimately led to abolition. Can you talk about the coalition? What brought you all together? What, from either of you or both of you, what from your perspectives were the key ingredients? Okay, so Dale, you were confronting the other side and finding not so much opposition, but ignorance, from what I'm understanding you to say.
Exactly.
That then led to outreach that meant that other groups and individuals became involved in the effort that ultimately led to abolition. For both of you, can you talk about that? About what brought the coalition together? What, from your perspectives, were the key ingredients that ended in success?
Well, a little bit of background. Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty was founded in 1991. So we have a 30-year history. And in the early days, the organization was largely a protest organization in the bad old days when 8, 10, 12 people a year were being sentenced to death and equal numbers were being executed. And really the core of the organization were people of faith around the state. And over time, that slowly evolved as attitudes evolved. The organization slowly became less of an outside protest organization and increasingly a more conventional policy-oriented advocacy organization. And the historic three key members of our coalition were VADP as the coordinators, the Virginia Catholic Conference, and then the ACLU of Virginia. So those three groups were the key foundation of the abolition movement for many, many years. And then in about 2015, 16, we began looking at reform measures in Virginia. And the one that we decided to focus on was a bill to exempt people with severe mental illness from the death penalty. And because of that, we were able to cultivate relationships with a pretty significant group of the mental health community in the Commonwealth of Virginia. The two most important groups being NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, the Virginia chapter, and then Mental Health America, Virginia. And those two organizations and their leaders became key additions to our coalition. And discussing reform of the current system enabled us to get meetings with legislators who probably would not have met with us if the starting point was abolition. And over the course of 5 years of advocacy, we were able to do a lot of education among moderate Democrats and Republicans about the flaws in Virginia's death penalty system. And we were able to grow support for that SMI exemption. And so much so that we were able to pass it in the state Senate in 2020 by a 23-17 majority, and then in 2019 by 23-17, and then in 2020 by a 32-7 margin. Very strong bipartisan support. But the bill never got traction in the House because leadership of the committee on that side just didn't like the bill and never would allow it to be heard or given a fair hearing. So that was sort of the precursor. And then as we really kicked off the abolition campaign, the key organization that joined us at that point was the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy, who were able to bring in an excellent set of relationships with Black clergy around the state. And Lakeisha Cook, who was their justice reform organizer and an ordained Baptist minister, was able to do remarkable work within the Black church community, bringing in a lot of support for abolition that I think ultimately helped us win the support of the governor. And his role was, I think, essential in getting us over the finish line. Mm-hmm. Dale, is there anyone I'm forgetting that we ought to mention?
Well, the Virginia ACLU has always been, an important cog in this wheel. So they were crucial. One thing I do want to add to what Michael said, one of the problems that VADP encountered in the early days, from when it formed in 91 up until the late 90s, was a unifying strategy or a unifying message from these different partners. There was one point where VADP wanted to focus on a moratorium on the death penalty, whereas one of the other coalition partners wanted full-blown abolition. And there was this butting of heads and this lack of a unifying message at the time. So I think what was so crucial with us when Michael took over in 2015 was to make sure we were all on the same page, that everyone was talking. When it was SMI exemption, we talked only about SMI exemption, not about abolition. Abolition, my first 2 years in the field, I talked only about exempting the severely mentally ill. The abolition never even came up. It wasn't until after we saw that we could push for abolition in late 2019, 2020, that's when we unified our message to go for full-blown abolition. So it was important that all these groups, the ACLU, the Catholic Conference, the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy, and VADP were all talking the same talk about the same topic, the same thing at the same time. And I think that was crucial. So we appeared very unified, and I think that helped our cause tremendously.
Well, I can only imagine, and that's a very wise strategy. It seems to me that instead of simply going full bore for abolition, you pick out the pieces that are most relevant to the groups to which you're talking.
Exactly.
That's very smart.
Well, it worked. Apparently it worked.
Good on you for doing that. Well, that being the case, what would you recommend for other groups? I mean, it's silly to say the same thing, but I know there are groups that are very intent on one approach. So what you're suggesting is taking a more, what would the word be? A multifaceted
incremental, approach. Maybe?
Incremental is a good word, yeah. Because there are so many groups in the country that are working in their states trying to achieve the same things that you folks did. But what you did was really quite astonishing. And it gave, as I'm sure you know, it gave an incredible boost of energy and enthusiasm to the abolition movement around the country. What's next then? I know, Dale, you're writing a book about the repeal with the intent of providing a guide for the states that intend to launch a similar effort. Is there a strategy, a roadmap, or is it every death penalty state unique in its system and therefore calls for a unique approach?
Michael, you take that one first. I'll follow you up.
I'd say that there are some common elements that I think are true for every successful abolition campaign. And there are at the same time unique elements to each state because the politics and the personalities are different in each state. One thing that I think is crucial is recruiting unusual or unexpected allies. And in Virginia, Jerry Givens, the former executioner, was really a very important figure. And in fact, during the abolition debate, several legislators mentioned Jerry by name and recalling his testimony on different measures at the General Assembly. Jerry unfortunately died in the very early wave of the COVID pandemic. So we missed Jerry. He wasn't around in the flesh to celebrate the victory, but I'm sure he was watching on in spirit and encouraging us. So having people like Jerry and murder victim family members, we had a group of about 25 victim family members in Virginia who were willing to be public with their opposition to the death penalty. And perhaps the most compelling voice was that of Rachel Sutphin. Her father was a corporal in the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department near Roanoke, and he was killed in a manhunt for Will Morva. And Will was the last person executed in Virginia. So Rachel's very public and very eloquent testimony in support of abolition was really key in the minds of a number of legislators to winning that victory. And in persuading, I think, some legislators who might not have otherwise voted with us. Her voice and that of other victim family members were really important. Another one that came in that really, I think, helped us over the finish line were the voices of prosecutors. In Virginia, the nemesis of VADP and our coalition had always been VACA, the Virginia Association of Commonwealth's Attorneys. In Virginia, prosecutors are called Commonwealth's attorneys. They're elected in each locality. And that organization had always opposed us tooth and nail at every point in time. Yet in 2017 and 2019, a number of reform prosecutors were elected in large localities. And by the 2021 legislative session, a group of 15 of them explicitly endorsed abolition. And together, they represented nearly 43% of the state population. So they had won elections in the largest jurisdictions in Virginia. So between Jerry's voice as an executioner, Rachel's voice as a victim family member, and that coalition of prosecutors, they really provided, I think, the kind of political cover that moderate Democrats and conservative Republicans felt they needed in order to vote for death penalty abolition. So I think those were all, and I think every state needs to engage those voices in their campaigns. And then the specifics of strategy might vary depending on composition of the legislature and the disposition of your respective governors. But I think those are very common elements. And Dale, I think you may have some further light to shed along those lines.
Yeah, Dale.
No, you pretty much hit on all the points. One thing that played in our favor too this year was the dynamics around the entire country surrounding the murder of George Floyd. and the Black Lives Matter movement, because that just shone a huge spotlight on the racial inequities in our criminal justice system. And in Richmond, we had the added bonus of having giant Confederate monuments still standing on public thoroughfares on Monument Avenue. So here in Virginia, the Black Lives Matter movement was centered around the Robert E. Lee Monument. So we had this double whammy of not only actions, the protesting of the shooting of unarmed Blacks by police, but this big Confederate monument devoted to this man who was a traitor and wanted to maintain slavery. So we had this giant thing right in front of us. And so these things played very well in our favor. Our board chair, Christina Leslie, is a woman of color. She wrote a very eloquent op-ed about things that she faced in going into courtrooms with clients. She said she and her client would be the only Blacks in the entire courtroom, and they were being heard under these paintings of Confederate generals still in these county courtrooms in Virginia. And so all these things just started piling up. And all of a sudden, who could not see the racial inequities here in Virginia in our criminal justice system when coupled with Confederate supremacy? So all these things just came. And when in 2021, when the window opened for abolition, we went in it. But as quickly as we went through it, that window shut, because we are pretty sure we wouldn't have been able to get abolition through in 2022 in this session. So we took advantage of a lot of things right at the last minute. Polling was very important. The ACLU helped us polling. We met with 52 legislators in 2020 by Zoom and said, do you have any questions about the death penalty? What would you like to ask us? Because we're going to put forth an abolition bill in the next session. And we found most legislators, again, knew very little about the death penalty. And so we were able to educate them. And they said, well, you know, I'm personally against it, but my constituents, I just don't know. Could we get polling? So the ACLU got polling in that district, which came out in our favor, thank the Lord. So all these things kind of came, and they all came fast and furious. We were having Zoom meetings practically every day leading up to the session and during the session. So there were a lot of things that happened that just happened right at the right moment. Some of them were the results of long-term planning. Some of them were the results of things that happened right at the last minute. So maybe in a lot of ways we got lucky, but in a lot of ways we were very strategic as well.
You know, I have to go back. You mentioned the article that you did on Jerry Gibbons. I read that years ago. Thank you for that.
Oh, sure.
That voice, the man who was there, the man who was doing the executing, was so incredibly meaningful in so many levels. And I think you can't understate or you can't overstate, I should say, the impact of that voice. And I think about it now. You probably saw there was an article recently about 3 members of the execution team in, I believe, South Carolina. 2 of them talking about the incredible emotional cost to them personally. This one man said, "I believe God has condemned me for what I've done." The idea that such that I keep trying to talk about, the idea that the pain involved in this process is not only inflicted on the person who's executed, it is the people doing the executing, the people who are associated with the process. It's so many ways in which this thing reaches out in waves that are so destructive. So
I think you're
bless
really
you.
absolutely right, Mike. And when I talk about the death penalty, I talked about the collateral damage that the death penalty incurs. And it falls on so many people. It falls on the executioner. It falls on prison guards. It falls on judges, on jurors, on attorneys. I've talked to jurors that talked about the trauma they experienced in capital trials. Dale met a judge who imposed a death sentence that haunted him. The death penalty exacts a deep, emotional, personal price for an awful lot of people.
There's actually a subchapter in my upcoming book about the costs of the death penalty, and there's one man featured in it. He participated in the execution of Frank Coppola in 1982, and he suffered PTSD so badly after that, and he couldn't get any help through the Department of Corrections. He wound up committing larceny and got 21 years of his own in Nottoway Correctional Facility. So, you know, and you never hear about these types of stories. You know, the people who engineer the machinery of death are very good at burying these stories. So that's why it's very important that we hear from these voices. You're right.
Oh, no, indeed. There was an article I read too from a woman who is involved in the criminal justice arena by being a prison guard. And she said there's an astonishing number of victims of PTSD among the guards in these situations because of the daily process of maintaining the life of someone who's about to be killed. What I know, Michael, you plan to stay active in the VADP. What are your plans?
Well, I'm now 66, and I am now only working part-time, and so I remain involved in kind of maintaining our coalition and keeping us engaged. In the 2022 session that just ended last Saturday, there was a bill to reinstate the death penalty for killing of law enforcement officers. And incredibly enough, the night before the House hearing, 2 police officers on the campus of Bridgeport University in Virginia were shot and killed.
Oh my God.
And you know, that could have been disastrous for us, but thankfully we were able to defeat the measure in the Senate, and in the House the bill never even was heard because we had enough Republican opposition to reinstatement. Even though it was under Republican control, it never was heard. So that's encouraging and bodes well for the future.
Yeah, that's always the big concern. I mean, you're going to have a reaction to your success in the side of the death lovers who will continue to try and press for and exacerbate and use every opportunity they can to point out the need for this process. So I guess we all have to remain on guard for those. But do you feel fairly secure at this point in where you are?
Well, especially now that the assembly has ended. Yeah, I feel really good. So
their hands
one
up.
One of the things I want to bring up, though, is that even in 2021, we noticed that, and the 8th Amendment Project director, Laura Porter, noted this too, opposition to abolition appeared rather lackluster. The fight was purely emotional on the other side, showing crime scene photos and only death will bring justice to the family and the old tropes that we've always heard. There was no real energy behind it. And this year, when this bill came up, the day after 2 law enforcement officers were killed at Bridgewater, again, it went nowhere. So what's telling to me is that maybe the appetite for death has waned enough that it may not be an immediate threat again. So, you know, we can only hope.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was one article that I read in a small town newspaper in Virginia during the abolition campaign in 2021. It was a local reporter talking to Democrats and Republicans in that county on the vote of a state senator who had voted for abolition in committee. And the Democrats were obviously very pleased, saying, "No, here's a vote that this Republican senator we can actually, you know, feel good about." And then when they contacted the head of the Republican Party in that county, and this is a county that voted for Donald Trump, I think by a 65% margin, the head of the Republican Party said, "Our local committee takes no position on the issue because our leadership is divided on the question."
Wow.
So if the Republican leadership in a rural Virginia county that voted 65, 66% for Donald Trump was divided on the death penalty. I think that bodes well for us maintaining the victory in Virginia.
From your
And I will
mouth.
say too, I was at CPAC for 2 years, helping conservatives concerned about the death penalty table at the vendors in the vending area. And I was very surprised going into CPAC, you would think, oh my gosh, we're straight into the belly of the beast, right? It wasn't like that at all. In fact, almost all young Republicans were on board with us. And they would come up and say, they would see the sign that says conservatives concerned about the death penalty. And they'd say, why should I be concerned about the death penalty? So, okay, well, come here. I'll tell you why. And by the time they walked away from that table, they were convinced and they had signed up on the mailing list. So it was very encouraging to see that the young Republicans were either ignorant at abolition, but were easily swayed into supporting it.
Well, I'm seeing that in Ohio today, so we're hopeful.
Yep.
Listen, I can't tell you how much it means to me that you have taken the time, and the honor we were able to bestow on you is small potatoes compared to what is due you. But this was an effort that involved many people over many years, and you were really the springboards behind it. So on behalf of all of us who've been working so hard for so long to see this awful punishment abolished on the state and federal level, I want to thank you for giving the heart and the hope to continue and achieve, or giving us the heart and the hope to continue to achieve what you did in Virginia. And congratulations. It's no small thing that you changed history.
Thanks so
Thank you,
much.
Mike.
It was great being with you.
Appreciate it.
And we're very
It really was.
thankful.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
very thankful.